I'm David Gronefeld. I'm here interviewing my father, Wayne Gronefeld. We're at his home out on Highway T in St. Charles County, Missouri. It's November 29th,
I think that's right.
the Friday after Thanksgiving in the years 2013. And I'm talking to him about his experiences growing up and about my experiences growing up as well. So the first thing I'd like to ask you about is about your parents. What have you been told about how the parents met? Where were they married? What did they do for a living? That type of thing.
I interviewed my mother several years ago before her passing, and as I recall, I didn't listen to that before we got together, but as I recall, she said they met at a dance in Colville. They were married later. My mother was, before she was married, she worked in the city of St. Louis. Her older sister had worked for some people in what we now call the Central West End. They had been, I would call them housemaids. Her older sister worked there before my mother went to work there, and my mother learned about the job that opened up down the street from where her older sister was working, and so she applied there and got that job. So she worked there as a young woman, but after she was married, she was a housewife until all of the kids were gone, and she was probably in her late 50s. And then she went to work as a nursing assistant in either hospitals. She worked at Christian Northwest Hospital or at nursing homes. She worked at Charlevoix Nursing Home in St. Charles for a number of years. My father grew up on a farm near Harvester, Missouri. His parents owned a farm there, about 160 acres there, plus they owned some land in Greens Bottom. He grew up on a farm, but as a young man, he decided that he didn't want to farm the rest of his life, so he went into St. Charles and got a job at St. Charles Quarry Company. I'm not sure what he started doing there, but he wound up operating heavy machinery like cranes and steam shovels in those days, and high lifts and things like that. Later on, when I was a teenager, he quit working there and started a business of his own. He actually had a small business on the side while he was still working there. He had several trucks, and he hauled rock and gravel and sand, and then also hauled water. He had a tank on the back of his dump truck, and in those days, most of the people in St. Charles County did not have what we now call city water, piped water in. They would have cisterns at their home and catch water off the roof and store it in a cistern. And if it was a period of time when there was no rain, then sometimes their cisterns would get low or even run out of water. They would call him, and he would haul water to them. He got the water from St. Charles Water Company, which was on Main Street in St. Charles, and then haul it from there to wherever. So he did that, and also had several other trucks. Now later on, when he quit his job at St. Charles Quarry Company altogether, he then went into the construction business a little bit more heavily and got a high lift and a drag line, and so he would dig basements and do sewer work and continue to haul gravel and rock and sand and asphalt and water, and that's what he retired from.
Where did he retire from?
He retired from his own business.
Okay.
That I'm not sure exactly when that was that he retired, but I was away from home and married by that time.
Did he have a pension?
Oh, yes, because while he worked in St. Charles Quarry Company, and while he had his own business, he belonged to the union. He belonged to the hoisting engineers, I think it was, union. So they had a pension system that he contributed to, and then he had Social Security. So yes, he had a pension. I remember my mom was always grateful that he was, at the time that he retired, he could decide whether or not he wanted to take an option on his pension where he would get a higher payment each month, but when he died, the payment stopped, or he would get a lower payment each month, but when he died, the payments would continue. And he chose that second option. So after he passed away, my mom still had his pension to live off of. Plus, she had earned enough and been vested in a small pension that she got from the hospital. So we grew up on an acre and a half. Well, that's not quite true. When I was small, we lived in St. Charles, in the city of St. Charles, on Jackson Street, 1160 Jackson Street. The house is still there, although if Lindenwood University continues to buy stuff, it won't be there too much longer, because it's right on the edge of where they now own property. And I guess we lived there from about 1942 to 1949. 1949 we moved to an acre and a half that my parents had purchased from my grandfather on his farm, and built a house and a garage, and later my dad built a couple of other buildings, a couple of shops where he did a lot of work on his trucks and equipment, and a storage shed and a small smokehouse. And that's where he lived the rest of his life, and that's where my mom lived until about 5 years before her death in 2003, when she moved into some apartments, senior apartments in St. Charles, and then rented out her old house.
Do you know when you mentioned that they met in Cotterville at a talking about my grandparents, your mother and father, met at Cotterville at a dance. Do you happen to know where that was in Cotterville, or?
I'm thinking there used to be. I'm not sure this building is still there. There used to be like a dance hall after you went through town, just before you got out of town, headed away from St. Charles. Now there's on one side of the street there's a restaurant. I think an Italian restaurant. There used to be a dance hall across the street from there. I don't think the building's there anymore. And they would have, as I understand it, they would have regular dances there. Like
So it was a
Saturday
dance
nights.
hall that was there in Cottleville
Yes,
that they had regular dances at,
Right.
and they met at that.
yes.
And that was in Cottleville proper, but kind of at the edge of town.
That's right, yes.
And it was on Highway N. When you say
It was on Highway N. Yes.
outside of town,
Yes, it was on
going
Highway
out
N.
Highway N before it makes a hard turn
Yes, that's correct.
after it crosses the creek.
But it was actually right before you cross the creek.
Right before you cross the creek, and then it,
Yeah.
because the town was pretty much all on one side of the creek.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Um,
Ran from the Catholic Church to the creek, basically.
mhm. And that would be the kind of the south side of the
I was trying to think of that.
creek, or is it kind of run diagonally? Southeast side of the creek, I guess.
Yeah, that would be, I guess it would be the southwest side of the creek.
Yeah, maybe southwest. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, for 1 year, I said we lived in St. Charles till 1949, and that's technically true. But my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, passed away in 1948. I believe it was 1948, and that left my grandfather, who lived in Cottleville, living alone. My maternal grandfather, Shade Casper, living alone in Cottleville, and I guess his kids got together and decided that one of them should look after him for a while. And so my parents and my two brothers, myself, moved to his house in Cottleville. At the same time, his sister, my Aunt Midge, she was actually my great aunt, but my great aunt Midge, Merckx, had been a widow for a number of years, and she had a little house in Cottleville, but I guess they decided that she needed to live with my grandfather also, and so all of us moved into his house. And I don't know what she did she had a little house in Cottleville, but I don't know what she did with that house. I guess she rented it out, is what I'm guessing.
She did keep it, because she went back into that house.
Yes, she did keep it. And so I'm not exactly sure when we moved there and how long we were there, but we were there approximately 1 year, lived at his home. And he owned a tavern, which is no longer there, but is right across the street from, I think it's a junk shop, antique shop, big yellow building there. Then we moved back into St. Charles very briefly, and then we moved out to Harvester, where my...
When you say across from, you're talking, that would have been in between his tavern and the creek, correct?
His tavern was located
I mean, it's not across the highway end. It's across
No, it's
another
across
side
a
street.
gravel. Well, it's probably paved now.
Yeah, it's
but in
paved
those
now.
days, it was gravel. And I don't know exactly. It's been so long since I've been through there. I don't know exactly what's across end from him. But he was on
Post
the.
office is pretty close to being
It's
directly across, although maybe not quite directly across.
no, it's a little bit further down the street
Yeah.
from the post office, and from Menino's Market.
Mhm.
That's right on the corner of N and. Well, it's right on the corner of
Where N makes
where
a
N
90.
makes a bend.
Yes, makes a 90-degree turning column.
Right. And it's down the street from there.
But you're not talking about the flower shop. There's a flower shop that's across on the other side of N.
No, there's
I thought it was a flower shop now, but maybe I'm mistaken.
it's. I really don't know what's across. There used to be a. It used to be all residential across from where his tavern was, and I don't know the names of the streets anymore in Cottleville. But at any rate, he had that tavern for many years.
I think it's where his tavern is now is like a wine tasting place that has a like a open area where the building was, but the house next to it is now like a wine tasting. I think they're using it for kind of part of their parking, maybe even.
Oh, could be.
I think maybe.
The last time I went by there were just a couple of buildings way in the back, and everything else where his building was, his house and his tavern, was open. And there was a residence right next to it.
I think that residence is now like a little wine tasting
Oh, it
thing
could be.
place, or it's like a little restaurant, or they have a little bit of food and wine or something, I think. And then I'm not sure if part of that area is not parking for them.
It could
now,
be.
but I'm
Could
not.
be. I don't know.
I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly.
But talking about those buildings in the back, he had a large garage and storage area, and on either side of the garage were outhouses because he didn't have. I do not know whether or not he had running water in the house, but I do know he didn't have bathrooms in the house. So, and this was 1948, so the patrons of his tavern and the folks who lived in the house used outhouses. One was for the men and one was for the women. He had a cistern out on the side of the building, and I just don't remember whether or not. I assume that's what we used for washing dishes and taking baths and drinking water and so forth. But I don't remember that part. I do know that he heated with like oil-fired heaters in each one of the. Well, not in each one of the rooms, but in the bedrooms and the. I guess he would call it the parlor. I'd call it a living room. And in the tavern itself, and he had in that storage shed, he had big 55-gallon barrels where he had heating oil, and you'd take a 5-gallon bucket or a 5-gallon can out there and fill it up, and then bring it in and fill the tanks in each one of those on the cold winter days. So, but it was that at the time I was 10. My next younger brother would have been 7. My next younger brother would have been about 3. And that doesn't seem like a good place to raise or to have kids, young kids, living or exposed to a tavern. But it was different kind of mood. It was a small town. Almost all the customers were regulars. Very few people that you didn't know were there came in. They'd come in an evening and maybe have one or two beers, most of them. Play cards, listen to the jukebox. Once in a while, you had pinball machines in there. Once in a while, they'd be playing pinball machines. You had a pool table. Once in a while, there'd be a pool game going on. But there never was a large group of people. It never was rowdy. Never did have to call the police for any reason. Anything like that. So and they were characters. Interesting people. As far as I know, there was only one black man in town. Can't think of his name right now, it'll come to me. He would come in, not so much every evening, but regularly, and he would sit in the back of the tavern by himself, right next to the jukebox. That's the only place he ever sat. And I'm thinking that that's probably where he was supposed to sit. I don't know that, but and he was a very nice fella. And there was a World War I vet who lived out of town a little ways. He had been seriously injured in the war, I think by an explosion of an artillery shell. Left him deaf and tore up his stomach. So when he came in, he would go to the bar. His name was Fritz Schulte. There's still Schulte family members living in that area. Fritz Schulte. When he would come into the bar, the only thing he would order was a white soda and an Eskimo pie. And that's what he would have. And he drove himself, lived about, I guess, mile and a quarter out of town, or from the tavern. Drove himself. When he'd get ready to leave, he would get in his car, and since he was deaf, he couldn't hear the car start. So in order to know whether his car was running, he would push on the gas as hard as he could, and you could hear the car go, and it would start shaking. Then he knew it was running. Let out the clutch. There he'd go. But he was a regular, but he didn't bother anybody and anything like that. Then there were a couple of neighbors who lived in that house that you're talking about. They had several members of the family who lived there, a couple of boys. And every once in a while, they would come in, and particularly one of them, probably shouldn't list names, but particularly one of them, sometimes if he had an argument with his wife, his wife apparently lived there with him and with his in-law, or with his parents, her in-laws. And if he had an argument with her, he would sometimes get drunk, and he would get on what they called a crying drunk. And Mary doesn't want me in the house anymore. He'd be crying and carrying on. So they'd escort him back home, and he'd be all right next day. But those were the kind of people that frequented the place, and everybody knew them. And they didn't, us kids would watch them play cards. They played games like euchre and shoot the moon, and I don't recall exactly how you play those anymore, but they very little, if any, money ever changed hands, but they seemed to have a good time and talked about the affairs of the day and that kind of stuff. But never any kind of rowdiness or anything like that. And as I mentioned, we lived there about a year. The time we lived there, Dallas and I,
And who's Dallas?
Uncle Dallas, sorry?
Who's Dallas?
Oh, he is my younger brother, and I.
Was he 3 or 7?
He was 7. We both went to Miller School, which was part of the Francis House School District, located on Highway 94, basically at the corner of Highway 94 and 61. It since has burned, but that's where we went to school at the time. It was, I think, a 4-room school. The grade that I was in, there were 2 grades in each classroom. I must have been a 5th grader at the time, something like that. And rode the bus from Cottleville, caught the bus up at where the post office is now. That was a grocery store called Schulte's Grocery. It was owned by the brother of Fritz Schulte, the World War I vet, and it was a post office then too. Oh, wait a minute. I don't think it was. I think the post office was in the store that's now the Yellow Antique Building. That was called Tiedemann's store, and that's where I think the post office was in those days, if I'm not mistaken. But at any rate, went to school there, and then after we moved into St. Charles, and my parents bought the land out in Harvester, the 1.5 acres from my grandfather. First built a garage, and that's where we lived until the house was completed. And that must have been 6-8 months. Don't recall exactly how long it was. But there we didn't, it was one big room. I don't remember how my mom, I guess maybe she had an electric stove, and the garage was wired so that she could use that electric stove. I don't know how she washed her dishes. Don't remember that. But we lived there until the house was completed, and then moved into the house. That was in 1949. And then, as I mentioned, that's where my parents lived until my father passed away, and then my mother moved away, I guess, late 90s to the apartment. And my younger brother Dallas, when he was, after he got married, he put a trailer, a mobile home, on the 1/2 acre part of the 1.5 acres, and lived there until he built his house.
And he built his house in what, 80? Somewhere around there?
I would guess somewhere around there, yeah. I don't know.
1980.
Right.
Do you know when your parents were married?
August of 36, I think.
What year?
August of 1936, I think.
August of 1936. Okay. Yeah, there is no August 36, is there?
No.
Gotcha. You mentioned 3 brothers, and Dallas was the youngest, but he wasn't the youngest. He was younger than you, but he wasn't
Yes,
the youngest.
that's right.
Who's the youngest brother?
Gerald. Jerry, we called him.
And you were born in 1938, and then when was Dallas born?
Must have been born in 1941. He's 3 years younger than I am. and Gerald must have been born 1946. He just turned 68, so that would be 1947 then. So he was actually, he wasn't even 3 when we moved into, he was only 1. Huh? Yeah, 6 and 7's 13, that's right.
So did you move from St. Charles to Cottleville?
Moved to St. Charles to Cottleville to St. Charles.
Okay. Back to St. Charles, and then
right. I
to
finished
to the country place, as
Yes.
Grandma would.
I finished elementary school, 6th grade in St. Charles. Went 7th and 8th grade in high school out in Harvester or in Francis Howell District. Now, when I was born, I think my parents lived in St. Peters, Missouri. And then, for a short period of time, and I don't know all the details, but for a short period of time, they lived in Harvester, Missouri, right in the town of Harvester, Missouri. Rented both times. And then they moved to Cottleville for a short period of time and rented again. And the house we lived in there was, I think, 2 houses away from what is now another little restaurant and wine tasting place across from the post office. Used to be owned by Kenny Schneider and his wife. I don't know Kenny Schneider?
Yeah, and he was the gym teacher at
Yes.
middle school, or junior high.
Right.
Junior high. And his wife is still, pops up occasionally.
Yeah, she's a
Financial
planner.
Yeah.
Yeah. Connie, is that her name? I
Yeah.
think that's right.
Yeah, that's her name.
Anyway, our landlord, when we lived there, I was just a little bitty guy. I was a little bitty guy when we lived in. They mustn't have lived too long in Harvester. And I don't know how long they lived in Cottleville at that time. They must have lived a little bit longer in St. Peters after I was born, because we lived in St. Peters. We lived on one of the streets that the backyard backed up to the railroad track. Because my mom tells a story, I don't remember this myself. My mom tells a story, she's probably been put in jail now, but she tells a story about one time she couldn't find me, and she started looking for me all over the place, and I was out on the railroad track. And so she had to bring me back into the yard. I don't know how I got out of the yard, but I couldn't have been very old, just wandering around. And I don't remember anything about living in Harvester. Well, I don't remember that story either. I just remember her telling it, but the railroad story. But when we lived in Cottleville, in the little house that we rented from the man who lived next to us, I do remember a couple of things there. One was he was a grumpy old guy, and he had a spot in the yard where there was not any grass growing. And so he decided he was going to plant some grass. So he dug it up, planted the grass, and he put a board over it. I don't know why he put a board over it. And apparently one day I was playing out in the yard and curious about the board, and I picked up the board and he saw me. And he came running over and chewed me out and chewed my mom out about me messing with his grass, and I shouldn't be doing that. And after I got a little bit older, I thought, well, how's that grass going to grow under that board anyway? But anyway, and then another thing I remember about when we were living there was apparently my mother had a garden or my mom and dad, had a garden in the backyard. And she, as did many ladies at that time, canned a lot of the vegetables that they grew in the garden. And in order to seal the jars, they used sealing wax. And sealing wax had to be heated on the stove. It came in a solid block or whatever, and you heated it on the stove, I think in a double boiler, and then it melted, and you poured that, somehow you poured that over the lid of your vegetables that you were canning. Well, somehow, while she was doing that, she had an accident and she poured it on her hand. Well, the wax was extremely hot, and she burned her hand, and she was in real great pain. So she sent me down to my grandfather's at the tavern to get one of her sisters. She had two sisters that were still at home at that time. They were not married, Aunt June and Aunt Jack, and I don't know which one I got, but to come up and help her, and I guess took her to the doctor, I don't know. So I remember having to run down there and get them and bring them up to where Mom was, up to our house, and then they took over and shooed me aside, and I don't know what happened, but well, anyway, I remember that story from when we lived there. And then from there we moved into St. Charles. So I guess we moved more, now that I think of it, I think of another place that we lived. I guess from there we moved into St. Charles, not directly in the house on Jackson Street, but in a house rented again, on what was called then Bunker Hill, which is located kind of behind, can't remember what, I can't remember what street it is. It's kind of located behind the conservatory, the Western House on the corner of Main and Boonslick, catty corner across from Trailhead Brewery.
Oh, okay. Down, all right.
As you're going toward Main Street on Boonslick, just before you get the block,
Okay.
before you get to
All right,
Main
where
Street,
they have
there's
weddings and stuff. The
yes, that's where
conservatory.
the conservatory.
Okay.
And just before you get to there, there's a street that goes to the right, and it was up there somewhere. So we lived there for a while, and then from there I guess we moved to Jackson Street. So we moved a lot when I was young, but then we stayed there on Jackson Street for a number of years, and then we stayed in.
Then you moved to Cotterville again and stayed with Casper, with your grandfather Casper,
Right.
and then you moved back to St. Charles,
And then we moved
and then you moved
to the country.
to the country place in Harvester.
Right.
On Grandpa's, your father's farm, acre and a half of
Right.
that original property.
And
Did he grow up on that farm?
actually, they moved some too. He talked about spending some of his youth in the Black Walnut area, the Orchard Farm area, down in there. And I assume his father rented that ground and farmed it. He used to talk about living in what he called the cul-de-sac, and I don't know exactly where that was, but it was down around Black Walnut somewhere. And then I guess, and I'm not certain about this, but I'm guessing that when his grandfather passed away, that's when his father moved to the farm where he is now, because that farm was in the family for a while before my grandfather had it. And then when my grandfather died, there were 5 kids: my dad, my Uncle Elmer, my Aunt Edna, my Aunt Ellen, and my Aunt Adele. 3 girls and 2 boys. 5 kids. My dad wanted that farm in the worst way, but he didn't have enough money to buy it himself. And they owned, and my grandfather owned 40 acres on Upper Bottom Road, and he owned about 16 acres down in Green's Bottom. And my dad wanted that ground the worst way. Then he was, at that time in his life, he was ready to farm. He wanted to farm, but and was farming some of the Green's Bottom ground, but he didn't have enough money to buy the land at that time. And one of the sisters, as long as I can remember, one of his sisters, as long as I can remember, seemed to have financial problems, always was on the edge. And she wanted to sell the farm now. She wanted the money. She wanted her, they all got, the farm was left to all of them in equal shares. She wanted to her share now. Well, the other 3, besides my dad, did not have an interest in my grandfather's farm. One of them had a big farm of his own, the other one lived in St. Charles, and her husband worked for McDonnell Douglas, and they weren't interested in messing with that. And his other brother, Elmer, had a big farm, and so he wasn't interested in any more either. So those 4 could not get together and buy it, because some of them didn't care to do that. So they sold it on the courthouse door. Had a tax sale. And so then, once they sold, well, my dad bought the bottom ground, the 16 acres in the bottom, and the other, not my not my Aunt Ellen, not the one who needed the money, but the other 3 did buy the 40 acres. They did decide they could get together to do that. But the bulk of the farm, which I think was like 160 acres, that went to a developer, and that's now where Millwood subdivision is located. Now after this is kind of a side, but after they...
Now, when you say they bought the 40 acres, was it on Upper Bottom Road?
Yes.
So that's up, not in the bottoms,
No.
but on the hills above the
hill.
bottoms.
That's right.
And the bottom ground was 16 acres.
Right.
And that grandpa bought that.
Yes. Now,
Your father, my grandfather.
your grandfather, my
Martin.
father.
Martin was his name.
That's right. Now, he farmed that 16 acres and worked the 40 acres too. But while he farmed the 16 acres, because he had the heavy equipment and stuff, there was more to it than, there was only 16 acres that was farmable. But there was more ground down there, but it had all these little saplings and willow trees on it. So he cleared all that out. So now it's about 32 acres down there that now Gerald and Dallas and I own. But
So, did he own the 32 acres?
yes, but as on the tax rolls, this is 16 because the rest was all it was unusable,
Okay.
but he made it usable.
And now is it on the tax rolls as being 32 acres? Okay. We don't know what's on the tax rolls
No,
now.
I have
Okay.
to wait until I get the tax bill.
Yeah, there you go.
Anyway, so the 40 acres now. Actually, 4 of them. I had said 3, but 4 of the 5 were in on the 40 acres. All right. So they each get 10 acres. Okay. Well, development comes along, and the developers want to buy the 40 acres because the subdivision, the ground that has been filled up with subdivision, they still have more demand. They want the 40 acres. They come and they want to buy the 40 acres. My dad says, I'm not selling my 10. The other 3 they're ready to sell because the price has gone up since they bought it, and so they're going to make some money. So those 3 sell their 40 acres. They sell their 10 acres each. My dad's on the far end, closest to Jung Station Road. He's on that end of the 40 acres. He keeps his 10 acres. They sell their 40 acres.
So they're 30 acres. 10 acres.
I keep calling it the 40 acres, but yeah, they sell their 30 acres. He keeps his 10. Well, that's my Uncle Elmer, my Aunt Adele, and my Aunt Edna. And my Uncle Elmer has a farm up in Moscow Mills. My Aunt Adele is married to a Rankin in St. Charles. And he worked at McDonnell Douglas, and then he retired, and then he went into a vending business. So he was, he wasn't interested in holding on to the land. My Aunt Edna married a Hemsot Road.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when 360, no, it was before 364, but at any rate, they had this farm there, and they also had a farm somewhere around, where was she? I don't remember where they bought another farm, but it was north of here. Anyway, so all those 3 sold their 10 acres each. Then Aunt Edna and her husband, they sell that farm on Hemsot Road too, and move up to where the taxes are cheaper and everything else. So the only one left with his 10 acres is my dad. Well, after about 10 years, this guy, the developers are pestering him and pestering him and pestering him. Finally, he sells his 10 acres. Well, he gets a hell of a lot more for his 10 acres than the rest of them got for their 10 acres because he waited.
Mm-hmm.
So he closes a deal, and he's happy, and the developer's happy. Gets a call from my Aunt Edna Hemsot, the one who sold her farm. She says, I understand you just sold your 10 acres to whoever. He said, yeah, I did. She says, well, and I understand you got so much per acre. He said, yeah, I did. She said, well, that's a whole lot more than what we got. He said, yeah, I think it is. She said, well, I think you ought to share with the rest of us the additional money you got. He says, and the harsh you wrote in. But anyway, so now we're down to the 1.5 acres and his 16 acres in the bottom.
Okay.
So that's how that all came about.
All right. So that's that story. I've heard little bits and pieces of that, but I never heard the whole full thing. I think maybe I'd like to stop now and see if see
Okay.
how it's doing.
That's fine.
Okay? So let's do that.